Well, thanks for that warm welcome, and it's a real delight to be back in Vermont. I'm going to be talking to you about the content of my new book, The End of Growth. It's the result of a couple of years of research. It started back in September 2008. Clearly, something serious was going wrong with our economy at that point, and it occurred to me at that time that the crisis was being framed in terms that were too narrow, that only accounted for what was going on within the financial industry. But it seemed to me that there was something more to the story than that. So I started talking to people. I began interviewing people on Wall Street, former managing director of JP Morgan, various retired hedge fund managers. There's a theme quickly emerges here. I tend to talk to retired people a lot because very often they know where the bodies are buried and they're willing to tell you. But a lot of former Wall Street people and a number of economists who work closely with energy and resource issues. Spoke also with people in the resource industry, petroleum geologists and others. My book has pages of acknowledgments, so I won't try to name everyone here. But very quickly, a picture started emerging that was very, very different from the one that we are accustomed to hearing through the media and through most of our political representatives. It's a very disturbing message, but it's one that I think is absolutely essential that we have as part of our national conversation. Because if this is true, it has enormous implications, not only for our economy, but for our political system and just about everything else. And I think it needs to be part of that conversation. If this is true, then we need to adapt to a fundamentally new economic reality. I'm suggesting that we are at a decisive turning point in our economic history, the end of economic growth as we've known it. Now, economic growth is something that every politician promises, and that every economist, or nearly every economist, I'd say well over 90% of economists believe is the normal and natural state of modern economies. However, nothing grows forever on a finite planet. We assume economic growth, and yet we live on a planet of limited resources. So common sense says that at some point we will reach limits to growth. I'm suggesting that we've done so, and just recently. Well, in order to tell you the story, give you some context, I have to start with energy because, well, first, energy is sort of, excuse me, sort of my subject. I've written several books on it, but also the reason I'm interested in energy in the first place is that it's the prerequisite for everything else. All economic activity depends on energy. And we are living in a very remarkable era in terms of our energy sources, the quantities of energy we use, and so on. Up until just the last couple of hundred years, we were using solar energy as gathered through green plants and channeled through animals. We exerted energy into our environment to change our environment, get what we wanted and needed by way of muscle power, and those muscles, again, were fueled by green plants and animals. So it was a very simple kind of energy economy, and one that sustained us for thousands and tens of thousands of years. Just over the last couple of hundred years, we've gotten used to a different kind of energy economy, a fossil-fueled energy economy. Fossil fuels, of course, were created by nature over the course of the last few tens of millions of years and are highly concentrated, energy-dense sources. And they have enabled a type of economy that never could have existed before. One way to explain this or to think about it, and I use this example in virtually every talk I give because it's so intuitively obvious, is to think of the last time you ran out of gas in your car and had to push your car a few feet off to the side of the road. If you have a big car, you might have needed some help to do that. It's a lot of work. And in fact, if you were to imagine pushing your car, let's say 20 or 30 miles down the road, that would be the equivalent of 6 or 8 weeks of hard human labor. That's really a lot of work. Okay, well, a single gallon of gas will do that for us, for which we're paying less than $4. So think of that, 6 to 8 weeks of hard labor energy equivalents for $3 or $4. You can't get labor that cheap anywhere on the planet. So that's why we've mechanized virtually every process of production and transport that we possibly could over the past 200 years. And that has given us enormous economic advantage. This is GDP per capita for the last 2,000 years. As you can see, even with empires rising and falling, there really wasn't that much change until just the last couple of hundred years. Suddenly, the amount of GDP, well, GDP, of course, is gross domestic product. It's basically the total amount of money that's being spent in an economy, but that's a kind of marker for consumption levels. We see consumption levels per capita rising dramatically in the last couple of hundred years, largely, well, economists would say because of markets, could say, well, it's because of technology, but really, yes, those factors have been part of the equation, but this certainly wouldn't have happened without fossil fuels. That last slide was per capita GDP, but of course there have been a lot more capitas to account for. Population has risen from under 1 billion at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to 7 billion today. So multiply that per capita GDP increase by population increase, and that gives you some sense of the extraordinary scale of expansion in economic activity that's occurred over the past 200 years, and especially the past century. That's economic growth. Okay? Now, much of that growth occurred right here in the good old USA, because we had bounteous amounts of fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas. In fact, this is where the commercial oil industry really got its start and took hold, starting in 1859 with the first commercial oil well in Pennsylvania. And for most of the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th century, over half the world's oil in any given year was being produced from oil wells in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Texas and Oklahoma and California. We weren't just the Saudi Arabia of the early 20th century. It went far beyond that. Saudi Arabia produces, what, 18% of the world's oil right now. We were by far the world's foremost oil exporting nation. And we were using a lot of oil here domestically to support industries that were expanding, like the automobile industry, the aviation industry, expanding to use that abundance of cheap, concentrated energy. So the problem actually in the United States in the early 20th century was one of overproduction. We could make things faster than we could buy them and use them. So we solved that problem in two ways. First was the invention of the advertising industry, talking people into wanting more stuff than they realized that they actually wanted. And that took all sorts of forms, not just taking out ads in the newspaper, but new strategies like planned obsolescence, making products that would reliably break down relatively quickly so that people would want to replace them. Also planned aesthetic obsolescence, designing objects that, so that their look would change every year or every few years, the latest Oldsmobile or the latest iPhone or iPad, so that everyone has to buy a new version of that product every few years just to keep up. Well, that was one strategy, and it worked very well. The other strategy that we used to deal with the problem of overproduction was consumer credit. The automobile was a key element in the industrial expansion of the United States. But automobiles in the early days were luxury items that very few people could afford, and most people were accustomed to buying things with cash. Automobiles were too expensive for people to buy with cash, so the car companies became also finance companies. So with consumer credit for automobiles, then the expansion of the housing mortgage industry, and then finally, toward the latter part of the 20th century, the expansion of the credit card industry, we see gradual, persistent, and over time, extraordinary expansion of consumer credit, which is debt. So, in effect, expectation of future growth becomes collateral for increasing debt. We internalize the idea that the economy is growing and that it will continue to grow, and the expectation is embedded in the American psyche that growth is the normal and natural state of affairs for the economy. We even altered our monetary system. 19th century, 18th century money was mostly gold and silver or receipts for gold and silver in storage. But over the course of the 20th century, we gradually de-linked money from precious metals. So what is money today? Well, money is debt. When you go to the bank and take out a $10,000 loan, the banker doesn't go in the vault and search around and find that $10,000 that somebody left sitting there. No, she or he just presses a few keys on a computer keyboard and calls that money into existence. And then when you pay back the loan, the money ceases to exist. It's magic. Now, the question that comes up, where does the interest come from? Because if money is debt, of course, debt requires the payment of interest. So where's the interest coming from? Well, it's coming from somebody else taking out a loan somewhere else in the economy. As long as the total amount of debt is growing and everyone's doing business with everyone else, working for them or selling stuff to them, then on average, most people are going to be able to pay back their loan with interest, and the whole system works just fine. Now, of course, if you kind of pull back and look at it from a distance, it kind of looks like a pyramid scheme, but we don't think about that. Now, there was a sort of turning point we reached in the 1970s with all of this, which was the time when hourly wages for American workers started to stagnate. And part of that was that American companies started outsourcing jobs. So American workers increasingly were competing with workers in other countries. So that was pressing wages down, so hourly wages start stagnating. Globalization begins with container shipping and satellite communications and computer monitoring of inventories and so on. And then with wages stagnating, how are people supposed to keep up and continue increasing their rates of consumption? After all, advertising is talking them into doing that, and we want the economy to grow, and 70% of the economy is consumer spending, so we have to keep people buying more stuff, and if they're not making more money, how do they do that? Well, with more debt. So starting in the 1970s, debt begins to accumulate and grow faster than GDP. So this leads to the financialization of the economy. As mortgage debt increases, credit card debt, and so on, the financial institutions on Wall Street begin packaging and recycling that debt in the form of mortgage-backed securities, derivatives, and so on. You all know that story. It's been well written up in the media. So this is what it looks like from 1980 to the present. Continual increase in total debt. As you can see, household debt, which is on the bottom here, has grown at least as fast, and in many years much faster than government debt. We're all excited about government debt these days, and government debt has grown very substantially, but not any faster than other categories of debt. Corporate debt, debt within financial institutions, government debt is the blue slice there on top. Until just recently, you see this inflection point in 2008 where something goes very wrong. Well, let's zero in on that a little bit. This is US year-over-year growth in private and public debt. So the red bars are mortgage growth. The sort of yellow, it looks a little greenish here, is credit growth in the private sector. And then the blue bits are US government lending and borrowing. And this is net, so this is new debt minus the retirement of old debt, okay? So up until 2008, we see most of the action happening in the mortgage area, and that's the famous housing bubble of the 2000s. But then, starting in 2008, virtually all new net debt is in the government sphere. So this is what happened. The economy began to contract. The amount of debt began to contract, which meant that the amount of money began to contract. We lost about $6 trillion of household net worth as a result of the collapse of the mortgage bubble. $6 trillion. So the government has tried to make up for that by bailing out the banks and with stimulus packages and so on, pumping money into the economy to try to keep it afloat. And we bought ourselves a bit of a recovery, a few quarters of GDP growth. But how sustainable is that growth? Is it possible that we have hit more fundamental limits to growth than can be accounted for just within the financial economy? If you just look at the financial situation, I think a good argument could be made that we have hit limits to debt in this country and in many other countries around the world. And it's going to take a substantial effort to find a workaround. Ultimately, there are going to be massive defaults within the banking industry and also sovereign nations. Again, that story is being pretty well covered in many of the mainstream media. But I'd suggest there's something more going on than that, a deeper level. Why did we reach this point in the 1970s and since then when we've been relying more and more on debt for GDP growth and less on real economic activity? Well, I think it all goes back to this. There was a book published in the early 1970s called Limits to Growth. It was the best-selling environmental book of all time. Where did it come from? Well, it was written by a team of scientists who used primitive computers and primitive computer programs and early preliminary data to try to model scenarios. And they were modeling scenarios of what could happen with the interaction over time of population growth, resource depletion, and environmental damage from industrial processes. So they ran a number of scenarios. Their sort of standard run scenarios assumed abundance of resources consistent with what was then currently known, the amount of oil, gas, coal, minerals, and so on that people already knew about, and assumed constant rates of population growth and pollution and so on. And that scenario, which was a very robust scenario because it kept coming up again and again, no matter how they tweaked it, showed a peak and decline in world industrial output sometime in the first couple of decades of the 21st century. So they ran other scenarios where they doubled the abundance of natural resources and plugged in policy efforts to reduce population growth or to reduce environmental pollution. And the results were a pushing back of industrial collapse by a couple of decades. So this was, of course, a very, very worrisome result. They reported it in the book, and it was immediately trounced by a lot of mainstream economists. Over the course of the next decade or so, articles came out in Wall Street Journal and The Economist and other journals suggesting that this was preposterous, the idea that there were limits to growth. And the critics took a couple of numbers completely out of context, out of that report, treated them as though they were forecasts, which they explicitly were not. And of course, they used only the most pessimistic scenario. And then when those numbers couldn't be made to agree with reality in certain cases, then the whole report was trashed. Now, in fact, of course, the surviving team of scientists has rerun the scenario exercise using more sophisticated computers, better software, updated data, and the same robust standard run scenario keeps coming up again and again. And other scientific organizations around the world have gone back and looked at the limits to growth scenario study exercise and found that, in fact, given the situation of the early 19th century, or early 1970s, the data that was available and so on, it was not just valid, it was extremely accurate. So we've been warned. We've had almost 40 years in which to prepare for the end of growth. And intuitively, we should be thinking along these lines anyway. I mean, after all, if so much of our economic growth has been based on increased energy supplies coming from fossil fuels, well, we know in principle that fossil fuels are non-renewable and therefore limited in quantity. At some point, we have to make a change, a transition away from fossil fuels. Now, whether the base of this little mountain here should look a little wider on one side or narrower or whatever, we can discuss that till the cows come home. What the resource base for coal or oil or natural gas is. At my institute, Post Carbon Institute, we've done a lot of analysis on these subjects, and I've written several books. And my conclusion is that we probably have a lot less than most people think. Not because the hydrocarbon molecules aren't in the ground. Everybody agrees that there are enormous coal, oil, and natural gas resources. The problem is we go after the low-hanging fruit, and it's really only the low-hanging fruit that does us much economic good over the long run. If we're having to spend more energy to produce a barrel of oil than the barrel of oil will give us at the end of the day when we use it, well, who cares what the price is and all of that? It's just not worth it as an exercise. We can still use that oil as a lubricant or as a feedstock for plastics or something like that, but not as a fuel. And a tremendous amount of the low-grade hydrocarbon stuff remaining in the Earth's crust is kind of in that category or getting close to it. So the problem of fossil fuel depletion is not just a theoretical one. We've seen here in this country, I spoke earlier about how we were the world's foremost oil producer and exporter in the early 20th century. Well, of course, now we're by far the world's foremost oil importer. How did that happen? Well, U.S. oil discoveries, which are the vertical green bars, peaked in the early 1930s. They've been declining ever since. And U.S. oil production peaked in 1970. And it's not that we stopped looking. I hear this all the time from folks who say, well, there's still a lot of oil out there. It's the environmentalists who are keeping us from getting it out of the ground. No. We've made huge new discoveries in Alaska back in the 1970s and in the Gulf of Mexico in the 1980s, and the oil companies had no problems at all getting permits to access this stuff and pull it out of the ground. And even with those enormous new oil plays, still U.S. oil production, which peaked out at close to 10 million barrels a day in 1970, is down to about 5.6 million barrels a day today in terms of crude oil. And some years are better than others, but the general trajectory is pretty clear. No matter what we do with regulations or abolishing the EPA, we could do all of that and it wouldn't make that much difference.